Suriname, odi foutang, Suriname. Misap tak bon funu, ode bezig no eluku a comedy a osofu a comedy na Israël. Maar mi be pramisi dat mokong na een vierdelige uitzending terug voor Frimas Rabota. En te Frimas Rabota, je happy voor free, je kondre Sranang. A kondre die je libi na ini, maar je no sabi sumanai brada, je no sabi na sumanai sa, omnati den witman, tja prati en libi a prati gi you, meki you want de kuli, you want de ingi, you want de blakamang, you want de alasani, boy tuan Sranamang. En a mansang, mo make you arkija, na o mansang, e verdedig, awam de brada funu, sang, unu, moksi fu kruisig amang, nanga de witman, pe, moksi fu kruisig, strevi, nanga a kondre. De man saba kondre moro you, de man sab you strevi moro you, en you no wan sab you strevi, omdat you want de alasani baar voor wan Sranamang. Wel, adis na wan Sranamang yara. Adisa wan Sranamang, dis ne kome ki bari gi ingi, dis ne kome ki bari gi nengre, dis ne kome ki bari gi unistani, dis ne kome ki bari gi Japanese snezi. No, dis ne kome ki bari gi Sranamang. Overs, en dan te wawang, dan van daaruit, dan salukuna fa wechari, den differenti funu, kon natapu, wang respecti de tifasi. Sela share sta fara we giftan san presture mo saija. Langa taki, no de selina, sang woso runja, na same taki, uno lek den Sranamang, mustang feti fu den, de witman kan go na vis rechter, wins de lanu desri bouten no demoro, maar de witman moest go na vis rechter fu den de onwaarheden san denatap de man net, na sa de man juku kona ini agrontapu, de luku a waarheid fu de man, sa wo sorry no. Yara? You Sranamang, you.
August 3rd, 1990. The Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti stands before Parliament and he confirmed what conspiracy theorists had long been saying. Yes, we had secret NATO armies. Yes, they operated for decades. And yes, it was all real. Within weeks, governments across Europe were forced to make the same confession. The secret they've been keeping since World War II? It was called Operation Gladio. So for a long time, Gladio sounded like a conspiracy theory. I think that's why a lot of people and academics haven't wanted to touch it, because they don't want it to be labeled as one of these tinfoil hat types. Then in 1990, it all stopped being one. So parliamentary investigations and judicial inquiries all over Europe forced governments to acknowledge what had existed all along, that clandestine stay-behind networks created during the Cold War were deliberately kept out of democratic oversight. So after World War II, the CIA and the MI6 helped to organize these covert cells, these structures across Western Europe that were designed to activate if the Soviet Union invaded. Now, to do that, they had to stockpile weapons and explosives and communications equipment in these secret caches. By 1990, governments across Europe, including the Netherlands, were forced to admit that they all had their own versions of these secret armies. So historian Daniele Gansler, in their book, NATO's Armies, has documented that these networks existed in at least 16 different countries. The Netherlands held out talking about theirs longer than most. Then in November of 1990, Prime Minister Ruud Lubbers finally admitted what everyone had suspected. Yes, the Dutch had a stay-behind network too. But his admission came with a carefully worded disclaimer. There had been no foreign or NATO supervision. So the Dutch network, Lubbers insisted, was different. It was more controlled. It was nothing like the whole Italian mess with its links to terrorism or right-wing extremism. Or so they would have us believe. The reassurance would be difficult for them to maintain. Critics often ask if there is proof whether these networks had operated inside their former colonies. And the answer to that is also yes. The Belgian government admitted that their secret army, SDRA 8, operated in the Congo and Rwanda and Burundi. And Portugal used similar networks to take down the anti-insurgency in Angola and Mozambique. So Suriname, if it was a Gladio operation, would not have been an isolated case. It would just be a Dutch application of a proven colonial model for dealing with left-wing communist insurgency. Now, this mattered because it reveals something fundamental about how Western states are managing risk during this period of time. When normal diplomacy fails, and when overt force is politically impossible, the governments reach to their quieter tools, to their deniable funds, to their unofficial intermediaries, to inducements rather than arrests, and exiling people rather than trial.
Yes, massive sir na massive. This na Mateus. Na masam te yu dat hij betang na se bouta en na mama stranang observera manisi.
Here's what made the Dutch case unusual. We have insider testimony that it happened. So Herman Schumacher, who served for 25 years from the mid-60s to about 1992, he was an agent and an instructor and a staff member for the Dutch stay-behind network. So when the network finally dissolved in 1992, 2 years after the Italian exposure forced everybody's hand, Schumacher received an official letter from Prime Minister Lubbers, a thank you note ultimately for his many years of service. So think about that timing for a second. And Andreotti's testimony comes in August of 1990. Lubbers admits it in November of 1990. The Dutch network quietly shuts down in 1992, and then a veteran operative gets a personal thank you note from the Prime Minister. So after retiring in 2004, Schumacher did something that was unexpected. He studied history at Utrecht University, and then in 2013 he broke his secrecy vow by writing his master's thesis called A Secret Organization in View. That's the English translation. You can go and read it online. You can find the links back on Substack. So this wasn't a conspiracy theory from some fringe activist. This was a primary source testimony from a 25-year veteran who had operated at every level, from agent and instructor and staff member. And this is what Schumacher revealed. The Dutch network wasn't called Gladio. That was the Italian name. The Dutch network was called INO, which I'm going to butcher the Dutch, but it's like inlichting and something sounding like operation. So intelligence and operations, ultimately. The clearest points of overlap for our story is this place called Villa Marchese, which is in Wassenaar. Now, Villa Marchese sits at General van Huyslam in Wassenaar, which is one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the Netherlands. So to anyone driving past, it looks just like what it is. It's a stately manor that was built in 1916, surrounded by gardens and trees. But inside of that building operated something else entirely. It's the nerve center of Dutch covert operations. So Villa Marchese, it housed two organizations under one roof.
Hier zo was Delano distributor geweest bij Limbo en hij had over het boek gesproken, over dezezelfde locatie. En vandaar weet je dat ik de boek en de foto van Delano distributors heb gebruikt. Rasta greetings, my bro. Heb gebruikt om even erop te wijzen van kijk, wanneer Delano distributors ging praten, ging hij niet liegen. Ik wil van dit moment tegelijkertijd gebruik van maken om de Surinamers te herinneren dat wanneer de Nederlanders en de mensen van de DDPA begonnen te praten met excuses, had Delano distributors gezegd van, oh nee, dat is te vroeg. Dat is te vroeg voor excuses nu. Bijvoorbeeld, we hebben die excuses nu niet nodig van de Nederlanders. Is een andere valstrik, dat had hij gezegd. En een heleboel mensen die hadden hem niet begrepen, zoals meneer Armand Suster Blunder. En hij heeft een heleboel geroepen, isabitak na faboutan lop sranamang, na faboutan lop sranang, en noem maar op, na faboutan lop blakamang. Alle dit soort zaken heeft hij geroepen. Uiteindelijk heeft de dochter Bigman hem weten te overtuigen van, nee, weet je, je moet het vanuit een andere perspectief bekijken. En uiteindelijk, wanneer we nu bekijken naar mijn land, dat je ziet, sang de lano distributor be bedoel. Omeni desma sang elibi in mi kondre no, abi wan partij, abi wan team, abi wan neng sang de wet magideng. Behalve aan neng sa we karon strefi stranamang. Behalve aan dati. Omdat if you look in a buitenlands beleidsstrefi, dat je ziet drapenstrefi je ziet. En if you look in de agenda voor de so-called politiek partijen, dat je ziet drapenstrefi, dat die de mano abi a ruimte voor oko na de brada. Omdat die de mano sabi a inhoud voor sang na wasranamang. De man sap soso, sa de wetman gidemang. En sa de wetman gidemang, na sang eigenlijk... als je hiernaar luistert, dat je de ososo de gebozo, dat je si napedema streka poti fu roko akondre en wamang sang bemoeilijk akondre na delanu des ribotes in de ma ai dat de man streka san pot dape fu hebengamang en dat unulek srana mang dan dat we wel meki bari fu gwenanga grani en plas fu udu a rechte sani na sang umus du. En de rechterstansa omus kari Nederland naar de westerse kondre kon ter verantwoording. Moteka ruimte ook toe voor je piki na tapu den smaf NPS sang e jompo e meki bari no. Sabi omdat mitaki abob na NPS minosabi if de mana saranamang of de mana VAP. Omdat die usap taki, te taki de man na VAP, dat wan taki de man na WEF. En temtak WEF na pe masra NPS fama ne baka be godape isabi na Switzerland sabi na WEF meeting amango en tego dape na dresiego teki en if je bribi om arki den sanja dat je verstaan als aan bedoel. Selassie, Rastafari, we give thanks and praise.
So you had Section I, which was the Inlichtingen, which is the intelligence, and then you had the IDB, which, Inlichtingendienst, maybe, Buitenland, which is the Dutch Foreign Intelligence Service. So people who collected intelligence abroad, they maintained liaison with allied services and they ran operations beyond the Dutch borders. So this is what everybody thought operated within Villa Marquesa. So then you had Section O, which is operations. It's the stay behind networks, sabotage, psychological warfare, resistance operations. This section reported directly to the Prime Minister, bypassing the Ministry of Defense's normal chain of command. So the camouflage was pretty elegant. As Schumacher wrote, the unknown stay-behind organization hid behind the skirts of this service for decades. If questions arose amongst officials about certain activity, secrecy seemed a logical consequence of an intelligence service. So read that again. Hid behind the skirts. So a quick little side note, in the 1950s, the Dutch military wasn't technically allowed to run spy operations in foreign countries. That was the job of a civilian agency called the BID, the Foreign Intelligence Service. However, the military didn't think that the civilian agency was doing a good enough job, so they created a shadow agency called the SAZVII, or 7. It was specifically to spy on East Germany. They hid this agency within a civilian one. So essentially they used the BID as a skirt or a mat.
Dus wanneer ik zeg free bota, dan bedoel ik free stranang. Bota be shina fisi, bota be shikbana fisi. En dat je ziet, de smaf minono so, hun stani effectief te kakondre, de ingitak akondre naf ding, de bus akondre smataki, de aandeel, noem maar op. Maar wansan nasa we vergeten dat die wasranamang akondre naf unu en alla sranamang ap evenrechte leki ibri wan trasranamang dat we vergeten. Omdat hebzucht naar een greedy, omeki, boom voor ufuno, normaal verstaan dat hij in plaats ulobu srefi, we lobby trasma. We lobby trasma. Da une lobu srefi, une lob een toekomst, une lobby akondre. En dan, temi taki, mastra bota beshi di safisi, de musluku. No so. Omeni, smasa meki bari, wa e-mailadres srefi, en mek de moeilijk. Omen smasa libines rana en meki bari, de shidati, de beperkt na internet. Alla de sana te congestek na luxe, in atensa weli bino. Painful.
To hide behind. So officially, MIVD selection lists now confirm the sheer scale of this shadow output. You had government records admitting that through SAZ-7, military intelligence, or G2, they were receiving dozens of reports a week, sourced from what they determined was a perfectly functioning agent network. They had books called Barracks in East Germany that was filled with clandestine photos of military buildings taken by these secret agents, and this admission validates that Villa Marquesa wasn't just this passive storage site, but it was the hub of a high-volume intelligence factory that was bypassing traditional oversight. Materials and equipment for Section O, procured through Section I. Finances for stayed-behind operations, arranged under the collective budget headings for Section I's accounts. The two operations would operate in the same building, sharing infrastructure, but they would maintain strict internal separation. Also internally, Schumacher noted, the strictest possible separation.
Ja, dit nog een keertje. Bouterse kong na limbo. Da bouterse mekushi wan buku sang auto abi aneng fu asem locatie disi. Da ma leg hoe uit eventjes, maar go in detail. Maar ma leg hoe uit eventjes painful. Painful Suriname. Painful. En if you see na fawe go om no na ene a comedy also fundape. Look fawe go om ini a comedy also fundape. Painful. Painful. Atompai. Painful. Ronnie Brunswijk. Painful. Yuna gewoon im liba heer sani. Yuna libim liba sani gewoon. Painful. Painful. Maar vrede tak yo guastrafu. Well, no so. Dus me no ligi yara moro betri guastrafu yara brucha. I want that you wear maskino.
Between I and O was maintained. So this wasn't just convenience, this was an operational firewall. It was, you could work for the Foreign Intelligence Service and never know that the office just down the hall was running NATO's secret army. So this is the same location where Sergeant Krishna Mohabir would be taken for 5 days of closed-door debriefing after fleeing Suriname once the Rambocus coup would fail. We're going to need to remember that.
Dus je Erik, bijvoorbeeld naar Pamego. Je heren naar Pamego. Naar Nederland amade, maar de metaki voor Rambocus coup. Naar Nederland amade, de metaki voor Rambocus coup. In Nederland. You know. En dus dan, toch ete wel op dentra li, dentra hebi li, na sa de ma legi, de sudati sa de ma legi, bauta. Do netak next. Maar, mensen, ito alisi, amoro betre ulu kuna nga suma we roko. Amoro betre uno meki de man fu VAP, chari, walo, chucha kong. Maakt niet uit if desma na NDP of desma de bunanga mama yeni anga disi anga dati luko suma desma et chako go onderzoek boom want no sokba me sisani en dan me wa opo ai abundang.
The IDB worked in Suriname using two primary methods. One was taking people, which is called human, and the other one is listening to secret message, which was called signet. One of their best tools was a listening station. It tracked phone calls and it tracked radio message coming out of Suriname into the Netherlands and back and forth. And this information was put into a daily report that was called the Green Book. By listening to these messages, this is how the Netherlands found out when relationships were getting stressed between Bouterse and Horb. And that gave them a good insight into the nature of the crisis and the government at the time. However, they couldn't do a whole lot to change it because the government in The Hague wasn't making decisions for Suriname anymore. The Dutch weren't the only ones gathering electronic intelligence on Suriname. Evidence of the United States NSA.
Dus mij sorry ja dat die officieel aan Nederlandse overheid no abnek futaki na abrastranang. Maar no vergeet je wana so you e denki. Ito alisi. Amante yu ataki officieel dus de man is sep zijn strana de masap. Alles aan sep zijn strana maar officieel aan Nederlandse regering no mantak nuti sang epsa na instrana officieel. Maar de mlukusa de metaki dat de me bouwa systeem bouw ba de Nederlanders, de Amerikaan, de mafu België, etc. Ano een mooi systeem. Maar na fu sorry dat sa you e bribi ano dat neng.
Electronic spying on Suriname dates back to the late 1960s when the USS Georgetown, Belmont, and Valdez were conducting operations just off the coast of Suriname. These ships used a cover story, which was they were supposedly investigating natural phenomenon, including radio wave propagation, hydrography, and oceanography, to hide their true mission, which was to intercept communications which would provide a basis for increased technical and intelligence knowledge. Evidence of this kind of electronic spying can be seen on a declassified CIA memo from March of 1982, March 5th to be exact. This report lists U.S. persons whose names were being caught in electronic surveillance. Well, this wasn't some kind of like passive sweep, general gathering of intelligence. The timing of this, not only does it coincide with the beginning of the Rambocus coup, but it also coincides exactly with Operation Queen's Hunter, which was this clandestine signet mission that used these modified Beechcraft King Air aircraft to conduct theater-wide eavesdropping across Latin America, where operations were going on in the month of March of 1982. So on this highly classified distribution list that they captured was the names of Ronald Reagan, the Secretary of State Alexander Haig, Colonel Albert Byes, that you remember from the Wolfpack episodes, who was the military attaché in Suriname who was doubling as a spy at the time. Now, the presence of Byes' name proves that Suriname, just 6 days before the Rambocus coup, had begun elevated to the same kind of surveillance dashboard as wars in El Salvador and Nicaragua. So the technical architecture that they probably used to capture information in Suriname would have been different than they would have been using in El Salvador because they didn't have the same infrastructure. So in Suriname, if you may have read some of my articles about the tracking stations that they were putting up, these LiDAR stations in Suriname, they were these geodetic mapping tools, and they had satellites and things like that they'd set up in the 60s and 70s. They may have been able to repurpose those.
Nahan in 60s and 70s, dan no so you like Suriname people's refi, you internet nou luxe gi. Mana luku olanga de man de basic de man de in you country de met kanga hier grond tapu de man updatori en dan use refi na beperk de me beperk omdat die bon volgens mij ben je me kwalijk tembe konam tegen dat de man me kwantu wet na regel gono sabi fuwe erbiedig ding en dan we kirun strefi we krapier sabi de man me kwelo share dape de man me kwelo share dape maar uiteindelijk anomacht zo na onkondre na unum abwa eenheid ama se takja anowa ingi ama se takja anowa blakaman ama se takja anowa hindustani anowa japanesi anowa snesi manowa libisma sambe tangna insranang en mama sranang observera man omdat die asapfa alla den trafolku sam karkon dape asapfa udenki asapfa asap sande nu tonton mama strana sap sande nu tonton en dat if unu srefi if un sef no sap sande in un tonton Dan we kusi jarati. Luku de Amerika sap ala sansan in you tonton. De mafwe AF sap ala sansan in you tonton. De mafwe AF sap ala sansan in you tonton. Dat nasame bedoel.
Suriname. We already knew they were using the ships as well. So that might have been able to provide real-time information to the White House about Suriname, whereas in El Salvador and places like that, they had to rig up these Beechcraft planes to be able to gather the same information because they didn't have the infrastructure that they had in Suriname at the time. So for the Dutch Yellow Edition and the CIA, Signet were no longer just a source. It was like a permanent 24-hour listening net that placed the unrest that was happening in Suriname and Paramaribo directly under the stare of Reagan's administration and their rollback doctrine. Understanding Gladio requires us to understand how stay-behind networks worked outside democratic oversight while maintaining this level of plausible deniability. So there was 3 protocols that made it all possible, at least in the Netherlands. One, you had something called the Green Pass, which is when you had a handler like a Schumacher, they didn't operate just as freelance agents. They carried these official authorization. They were specialized passes signed by the Chief of Army Staff, also called the Commander-in-Chief, and the Secretary General on behalf of the Minister of Justice. So this Green Pass ordered police and military personnel, Kmar, Royal, I don't know how to pronounce it, to assist the bearer of the Green Pass without any question. So no explanations were required, no paperwork was filled out, no records maintained. These provided a legal immunity for moving weapons and radio and classified materials across the Netherlands. So a handler who had one of these Green Passes could transport stay-behind equipment and recruit other assets and conduct operations, all with the full backing of the state authority, but none of the accountability that came with it. And if they were questioned, the handler simply produced the pass. The investigating officer was ordered to assist and forget that it ever happened. So the system was designed to leave absolutely no trail. And this explains why individuals like Peter van Happeren could easily access military facilities later in 1983 when they went to the Johan Wilhelm Friso barracks in Assen. They had that obstacle course. If you've read about this, if not, we'll get to it later. It's okay. But in May of 1983, despite the fact that he had no official military status, his handlers carried authorization that overrode the normal security protocols. They had a green pass. Now, the second thing that they had was something called a harpoon loop, which was this circular intelligence routing protocol. So stay-behind networks generated intelligence. We've already talked about that. But the intelligence couldn't be reported through your normal military channels, so it would expose the existence of the parallel network itself. So what they came up with was a solution called the harpoon loop. So agents used harpoon burst transmission radios to send encrypted signals to the UK or to the US base stations. There, Allied intelligence decoded the transmission and they relayed the intelligence back to Villa Marquesa as Allied sharing. So this whole circular route created plausible deniability. What Parliament saw was intelligence that was being collected from Allied services. They didn't see the whole domestic stay-behind operations that were really getting it. The source was hidden in the routing. So when questioned about intelligence origins, officials could truthfully say, we just received this from our NATO partners. They omitted the fact.
Daarnet me betekent dat die regering van Nederland etaki no unebu muyang asan nati omnati maar regering van Nederland sabi abra huise manese Nederlandse regering sabi de maar sabi dat die omnati de maatregel e financiera oso dat de meroko samen na dus dat die na adel voor EF dat nadeel voor EF. If you want to NAVO, if you want to cargo, nou weer EF. You know? Omdat die de man ego abra weer economische fonds.
The Dutch agents had actually generated the intelligence first. So the Harpoon Loop explains how Willem Marchesa processed Suriname intelligence from Allied sources during the March Rambocus crisis, intelligence that Dutch handlers like Gorlitz, which is one of Peter van Happeren's handlers, might have actually collected, but they routed it through intelligence stations for cover. Now, we also talked earlier about SAZ-7, which was like the cleaning station. So inside Villa Marquesa, there was this specific liaison bureau, the SAZ-7 military desk, and its function was simple, but it was critical. It was to take intelligence from the O&I, that stay-behind operation, and to reformat it for distribution to the military intelligence services like MID, G2, and LAMIT. So this whole cleaning process removed the fingerprints of the stay-behind operatives. So the source attribution changed from being O&I agent to being foreign intelligence contact. The collection means and methodologies were sanitized, the distributing routing was altered, the classified levels were adjusted. So the official government document explains the logic behind the trickery that was used. It used the phrase forced constructions of authority to describe how the system was set up. It's the government's own way of admitting that they used a messy...
The government own way of admitting. So mensen, ik van Taki, dit is naar deel 1. En we horen langer, omdat die, if we horen langer, dat is maar een man, Arkas aan Lucas aan boom. Maar de bedoeling is om jullie te wijzen van in plaats een play president of een play voor zit kondre dat we go zit bigi belang uno mag gebruiken uno voor teki organisatie mopo na tra kondre konsang emeklik de lobunu waarvan usaptak de mano lobunu moro piteng in plaats go play le kwego isablik we go sit sani we go play uno pota president na in no one nonsense omdat die je moet sap nanga sumaye roko yom sap nanga sumaye roko if de man fu de man egi kondres if no one rokanga de man tapu anifo fu tapu anifo di uno wani anoroko yara anoroko mensen deel 1 de olibenja ma uno vergiti dati ya moro deel e ko moro span alla den sansa me delen na you kan verstaan sana je positie na ina grond tapu sana je positie na ini mama stranang I'm out.